in a few seconds.
All right. All right. Welcome everyone to our post-International Moon Day event. Today, our webinar will cover the theme of benefit sharing of lunar resources activities for Africa. And what we are going to do is we are going to analyze the regional and international context with a focus on expectations, on the needs, and also the obstacles related to the participation of African countries in space resources activities on the moon and associated value chains. So with no further ado, I pass on the floor to Nifemi, who will take us through the introduction to this webinar, and then we will go through the presentation of our 4 speakers, followed by 30 minutes Q&A. Thank you very much, and wishing you a great webinar. On to you, Nifemi.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. Nice to be here. I'm happy to see everybody. Today's webinar, as Christophe has been kind enough to put us through, is on benefit sharing of lunar resources for Africa. And there's going to be a lot of analysis on the regional and international context and what that means. I am currently the co-lead with Jessica for the Commercial Space in Africa group of the Space Law and Policy team with the Space Generation Advisory Council. So we're proud and happy to be doing this with the Moon Village Association, and we trust that it will be a great webinar and everyone will learn. We hope that it will be interactive. Please ask questions, and we hope that you make the most of this day. And great to have everybody. Happy International Moon Day.
All right. So the first speaker in this joint webinar organized between SGAC, Space Generation Advisory Council, and MVA, Moon Village Association, is from SGAC. Mr. is yours, Kingsley. And Kingsley, you're mute.
Oh, good afternoon from this end. I don't know the time zone where you are. It's actually afternoon here in Eden, Nigeria. So good afternoon, good day, everyone. I'm happy to be here this afternoon. And I know we're going to be having a wonderful session. Thank you, Chris, Nife, and Jennifer, for the opportunity to be here to share my thoughts on this issue. So I'm going to be discussing the first topic, which is space law and governance, Africa participation in international fora. Please, I don't know, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So we're talking about space law, and I'm very sure that many of us on this meeting are familiar with the term space and space law. So the critical question that one may have to ask is, why talk about space law and governance? Space law and governance is essential since the Russian first will I say voyage to the space and the subsequent move by America and the rest of the world. It has become an interesting subject globally, and space has a lot to offer when it comes to the future of our planet. Hence, it is important to talk about the law and governance of this all-important aspect of our existence. So space law is key, and space law is important. And it's because of this that we are also gathered here this evening to share our thoughts on this unique topic, which is space law and governance. Then first of all, what are the key space laws that we have? Because of time, we are all familiar with the 5 major international agreements on space, which are being projected: the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, the Rescue Agreement of 1968, the Liability Convention of 1972, the Registration Convention of 1975, and of course, the Moon Agreement of 1984. It is also important to know that of these 5 treaties, the Outer Space Treaty has the highest number of signatories and ratification. And interestingly, today is Moon's Day, but the Moon Agreement has the least number of ratification as it stands now. And these treaties are all important because they touch on various aspects of space and space governance. Whereas the Outer Space Treaty deals with generally issue of space, the other 4 treaties focuses on specific issues. For instance, the Rescue Agreement talks about rescuing of astronauts and welfare of astronauts as well, while the Liability Convention talks about liability for damages or harm caused within the outer space or from objects that are in the outer space on Earth and spacecraft as well. And I'm particularly interested in Liability Convention, being someone that has background in environmental law, so it has a lot to offer, especially when we talk about space debris and orbital waste management. Then the Registration Convention is also very, very important because it gives credence to the Liability Convention in the sense that the first question that comes up whenever the issue of liability comes up is the registration and the launching state, and the registration title takes care of that aspect. Then the Moon Agreement is the first treaty that focused on a particular planet, unlike the rest of the agreements that were general in nature and talked about specific issues. So these are the 5 major laws that regulate space governance globally. And we also have the treaty banning nuclear weapon tests in atmosphere of 1963. We also have the convention relating to the distribution of program carrying signals by satellites of 1974. We also have the agreement relating to the International Telecommunication Organization of 1971, the Convention on International Mobile Satellite Organization of 1972, and the 1992 International Telecommunication Constitution and Convention. These are various laws that we have, or agreements or documents or international instruments that relates to treaty. These are not all, there are still many more, but for the purpose of this presentation, I actually picked out these. Then at international level, we also have institutions that are established for space governance, the principal of which is the Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space. This committee is actually a UN committee that was established in 1959 for the purpose of governing the exploration and use of space for the benefit of mankind. And this treaty this committee was actually at the background of the 5 major treaties that we've talked about, as these were actually pioneered through this committee of the United Nations. Then the principal focus of this committee is to achieve the following as being projected: space and climate change, space debris, disaster management, space and water, space law, space weather, space and global health, and a whole lot of other issues. These are the mandates of the UNCOPOS. Then, as it stands now, we have 95 members of the UNCOPOS, and out of the 95 members, 20 of such members are African nations, as listed: Algeria, Benin, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Chad, Egypt, Ethiopia, Ghana, Kenya, Libya, Mauritius, Morocco, Niger, Nigeria, Rwanda, Senegal, Sierra Leone, South Africa, Sudan, and of course, Tunisia. These are African nations that are part of COPOS. Sorry, going forward. Then we also have the UNOSA, which is the United Nations Office of Outer Space. And these UNOSA is actually the secretariat of the COPOS, and it actually takes up the day-to-day running of the activities of the COPOS. And it also partners with different space agencies and collaborates with different space agencies in terms of capacity building, and it also supports activities being carried out by different states as regards to space. And now we need to come down to look at the Africa and space participation. Africa has been involved in space participation from the beginning, but first of all, we need to understand the African continent. The African continent is the second largest continent, and it's also composed of the 6% of the world, and 20% of world emerged land also resides in Africa. Then 55 countries make up the African continent, and as such, African continent is very, very important when it comes to space activities, because it is a major continent, and in the sense, in terms of population and in terms of strategic positioning, being that some of the African countries are around the equatorial zone, and because of this, Africa is very much important whenever we talk about space and space activities. More so, the southern hemisphere of Africa is also a very good location when it comes to space observation and space launching. So it makes, satellite launching. It makes Africa very, very unique and important whenever discussions on space are on. Then why should Africa be interested in space activities? Africa needs to be interested because of agricultural support. Space will help Africa in terms of agricultural support. It has also been helping in water resources management, disaster monitoring. Is on record that the Nigerian Sat-1 was the first satellite that picked up the affected hurricane of America that happened in America in the early 2000s. So space is also important to Africa in terms of climate action. A lot of African countries are facing serious environmental challenges as a result of the effects of climate change. And effective use of space and space technology can help Africa in this regard, in terms of commercialization and also industrialization, space has a role to play in Africa in this regard. Then security is a major concern in Africa. Then space can actually assist African countries in the area of monitoring activities and remote sensing activities, and also to provide real-time satellite footage of terrorist hideout and things like that, especially in a country like Nigeria, whereby drones have failed in tackling insurgency in Nigeria because the insurgents usually shoot down the drones. But if it is from the space, then the insurgents will not be able to attack such facilities. Then sustainable development, economic development, and also in the area of capacity building. So, sorry. Then let's look at the African space climate. As it stands now, there are 53 satellites that have been launched by African countries, and these have been launched from 15 African countries, and 9 of the satellites were launched by commercial entities. And it is also important to note that the first satellite that was launched from Africa by an African country is the Sunsat-1 of South Africa. Then it's also important to understand the African climate space in the sense that, as it stands now, the space evaluation of the African space evaluation stands at about $19.4 billion. And these cuts across different areas from budgeting to commercial exploration and remote satellites and every other component of space in Africa. So as it stands now, the entire space valuation of Africa is even roughly less than the budget of US annual budget on space. It shows that though the African market is large and big, but it is also shrunk in the terms of its capacity, in terms of its funding. And as such, space collaboration and African participation in international space is also very important. Then let's also look at Africa and Space Agreement. You can see from the slides that many African countries are not active when it comes to space agreement. The first slide has to do with outer space treaty. The second is on the rescue agreement. The third is on liability convention. The fourth is on registration convention. And the last column is on moon agreement. Then if you look at the slides, you'll find out that the first country there, which is Algeria, has ratified the outer space treaty. They have also ratified the liability convention and registration convention. But from the look of things, you find out that many African countries have not ratified most of these space treaties. And the starting point for engagement normally should be from being part of the international community that are involved in space governance. So this is a major problem when it comes to Africa. Africa have not yet been properly involved in space governance, in the sense that Africa have not acceded to most of the space treaties. Then some African countries do not even belong to any or have not acceded to any of these treaties. However, Africa has been much more involved in other space-related activities that are different from the 5 major treaties that we've talked about. For instance, the Treaty on Ban of Nuclear Weapon Tests in Atmosphere, most African countries are part of this or have ratified this treaty, except for Namibia and Zimbabwe. Then we also have the ITU Convention, which have also been ratified by most African countries, except for Eritrea and Southern Sudan. It shows that in terms of international participation, when it comes to space instruments and agreements, Africa has performed below average in this regard, as most African countries are not properly represented in this regard. Then we also look at Africa's space activities. From the PowerPoint, we can see that the red-colored part has to do with African countries with satellites. We can see the African countries with satellites, and then the African countries that are promising are also highlighted in yellow. And then we can see that the rest of Africa have nothing doing when it comes to space. So larger population of African countries are not involved in space activities as at the moment. So most of African countries are not involved in space activities, as we can see from the slides. Then when it comes to international participation and collaboration in terms of launching of space satellites, we can see that Africa has also collaborated with other parts of the world. We have a lot of collaboration with Russia, France, US, China, India, Japan. But unfortunately, as at the time of the research of 2002, no satellite have been launched directly from Africa. But the African satellites have all been launched from either Europe or America or Asia. So in terms of capacity building, we still have a long way to go in Africa. Then it is also important to state that Africa has collaboration with the rest of the world, like the partnership between US and Africa. NASA have been supporting several African nations with their space activities, like NASA agreement with South Africa, NASA agreement with Algeria, NASA agreement with Nigeria, NASA agreement and support to Ghana, and NASA support to Egypt as well. Then lately, just late last year, Nigeria and Rwanda acceded to the Artemis Accord of US, and I know someone is going to be discussing the Artemis Accord with us later in this presentation. We also have Africa collaboration with the European Space Agency. European Space Agency have also been of helping hand to several African space programs, like in Nigeria, in Ghana, and of course the Angola, in Angola as well. Then Russia has helped several African nations to launch their satellites, same with China. So Africa has been collaborating with the rest of the world when it comes to space participation. However, like we stated, these activities have actually been limited to less than half of the African population, because out of the 55 nations in Africa, the countries that have one or two things to do with space are not up to 25 at the moment. Then we also have African initiatives to support space participation and development in Africa. We have the African Space Policy and Strategy. The space policy emphasizes more on the enabling framework, while the strategy seeks to ensure that Africa builds the needed indigenous capacity to operate its space activities and also to assist in providing products that are required for socioeconomic needs of Africa. So the strategy and policy is clear, and it's based on this that Africa has also come up with the African Space Agency that is based in Cairo, Egypt. And this space agency helps to coordinate African space activities and also to assist African countries with their space engagement. So by and large, Africa has been doing a lot, but the activities are limited to only a few nations. Then at national level, different countries have also been engaging with the world when it comes to space activities. Nigeria has been involved in space, and South Africa and Egypt have actually been taking the lead when it comes to space law and policy in Africa. These countries have designed and they have their space laws, which are actually operational as we speak. So it shows that Africa has come a long way when it comes to space participation. But there are still challenges that are affecting Africa's interaction with the global world when it comes to space activities and space governance. Some of these challenges faced by the African space industry are poor funding. Most of African countries that are involved in space are poorly funded. For instance, in 2021, the South African budget for space, which was the highest in Africa, stood at about 196 million US dollars. Then, and when combined, the entire budget of space activities in Africa was about 500 plus million dollars for that particular year. Then when compared to India, India has over $1.2 billion budget for space. Then we can't even be talking of country like US that has about $29 billion budget for space activities. It shows that space activities in Africa as it stands now is poorly funded, and there is need for Africa to galvanize resources and funding for space activities. Then there is also lack of adequate capacity, as we can see that most of our STEM have actually left Africa in search of greener pasture, because most of our scientists, technologists, engineers, and also mathematicians have left for Asia, left for Europe and America in search of greener pasture. It was recorded that as at last year, over 7,000 experts in this field have left Africa, and it's causing a lot of brain drain. And Africa needs to develop its own resources, and in this regard, manpower. Then there is also the issue of political uncertainties in most African countries. Like former US president once said that in Africa, we have strong men and not strong institutions. Most of African space agencies and space authorities always have, and even countries have strong leaders who are visionary, who have plans, but once they exit office, the successor will always come up with new ideas and start all over afresh. There is a need for Africa to have stable policy and also to have that political stability. Then there is also lack of adequate synergy and cooperation between African countries when it comes to space activities. Knowing fully well that our funding is low and we can't compete actively with the rest of the world when it comes to space for now, there is need for Africa to have this synergy and for African countries to also collaborate with each other. But we have not had much of this in recent past and even currently. So this is also a major challenge when it comes to international participation and participation for African countries, because some of the smaller African countries can actually come up together and even possibly have a joint space agency that will coordinate its space activities. Then the business environment. Most African countries are facing one challenge or the other in terms of crisis or insecurity. So this affects investor drive and direct foreign investment. Most people will not want to invest in areas that are volatile, that are exposed to crisis. So these affect the African market. Then lastly, but not the least, there is also lack of political will by the political class to invest in space, and the issue of the misplaced priorities. Most African heads of state will rather prefer to ride in motorcades of 20 to 30s and complain of, and they will always complain of shortage of fund, but there is always enough fund to actually fund their luxurious lifestyle. There should be, there is a need for the reorientation of African leaders when it comes to setting their priorities right, because getting space right means getting the African future right, because a lot of other developmental issues that are actually on the low in Africa now can be sorted out if we get our space activities right. Then the way forward is that Africa needs to build its human capacity. We need to invest more on people. We need to come up with a lot of scholarship. We know that in different countries there are space centers. In Nigeria, for instance, we have about 6 space centers that are running. However, these space institutions or centers, on the face of it, are doing very well. But when you visit these centers, you will actually know that a lot is going on in terms of cosmetic nature of these space centers. These space centers lack funding. These space centers are mostly abandoned. For instance, I visited the headquarters of the Nigerian Space Agency. It looked more like an old institution that seems close to something that it has been abandoned. But a lot of human resources are found there, hardworking young people who want to succeed, but the enabling environment is not provided. When contrast this with Supraco, this Pakistani space agency that I visited last year, I saw the infrastructural development, the availability of resources to work with. So this actually shows that in Africa, a lot needs to be done in terms of human capacity development. And we also need to work more on improved funding. This funding can actually be harnessed locally or by creating an enabling environment for investors to come into Africa and invest. Then there is need for better synergy and African cooperation. African countries need to collaborate. They need to partner with one another when it comes to space activities. Then there is also the need for political will by the political class, because most of these activities cannot ride without the political will of the political class. And then finally, there is need for Africa to invest in local technology. There is need for Africa to invest so much in local technology. If brain drain can be stopped and many Africans are drawn home to develop local technologies that will support space activities, Africa will stand on a better footing to compete with the rest of the world in space activities. I know that we are not yet there. I know that we are not where we ought to be, but I'm still optimistic that the African space sector will work. And I know it's going to work when we put our house in order, and that will be done by the special grace of God. So thank you very much for the time. This is my presentation. I don't know whether we're going to take the questions now.
No, later. At the end of the whole presentation, thank you so much, Dr. Onu. And
thank you.
Also for the very comprehensive review, we learned a lot. And also, I would like to remind people who may not be aware of it, that Kingsley is very strong on climate action. So if you are interested, people who are specialists in space for climate action, in addition to all the topics, Kingsley is one man definitely. Our next speaker is David, and with no further ado, I will pass on the floor to David, and a gentle reminder that our time allocated for each speaker is about 15 minutes, so that we have time in the end for the Q&A. Thank you very much, and the floor is yours, David.
Thank you very much for the time that you've given me to address this very interesting but also important aspect of space engagement and exploration. I've been asked to address the question of in situ resource utilization on the moon and how to balance the rights and needs of developed spacefaring nations and emerging and aspiring space entities and actors. For the duration of this speech, I'll mostly be talking about in situ resource utilization as ISRU. So if I say ISRU, you would probably know what I'm talking about. It's in situ space resource utilization. So as access to space becomes more democratized, especially in the 21st century, it is very crucial that we establish a governance framework, partnerships that allow all nations to benefit from the vast resources that are available on the moon and elsewhere in space. So when you talk about ISRU, we are talking about the concept of leveraging local resources in space for activities such as construction, life support, fuel production, etc. This is very, very, very important because if we are to look at long-term space exploration missions, usage of such resources becomes a matter of life and death in most instances, and a matter of whether that a mission can succeed. So, for example, on the moon, we have water ice and regolith, especially water ice on the poles of the moon, which is very important for water, gaining water, which is used for not only as the fuel, but also for sustenance for moon missions. And these present prime opportunities for Israel, but they could also lead to harmful exploitation if they're not regulated properly. So I would say that to outline the landscape of stakeholders, different issues and equitable access and proposing solutions that enable inclusive development is a very timely conversation that I think, as we celebrate the International Moon Day, is one that's to be had. So let me first give a brief background on Israel. So Israel allows space actors to use locally available resources like lunar ice, regolith for essential functions such as habitation, fuel production, and manufacturing. Now, this is very important because it reduces the need to launch supplies from Earth, and it enables more sustainable long-term exploration and settlement. Remember, one of the issues that we have with deep space exploration is that the cost of transporting matter from Earth to space is still quite high. And because it's very high, that limits how much space exploration can be done. However, if, for example, lunar ice at the poles of the moon could be processed into hydrogen and oxygen to make rocket fuel and breathable air, and regolith, or what you may know as lunar soil, the soil of the moon, could be used for construction purposes such as landing pads and habitats and shielding from radiation. This could be utilized to, as on-site resources to make moon habitation much more cheaper and even much more long-term, which then would even be utilized for even deeper space exploration. Now, while ISRO holds great promise to enable ambitious space objectives, the techniques are still very in early development and the visibility are not yet fully proven. For instance, critical technologies such as cryogenic fluid storage still face engineering challenges. However, environmental risks associated with lunar mining, those still require study, but the sky is still looking pretty much up for most of these technologies that would be needed for proper in situ resource utilization. And in fact, there is quite a lot of research and development that is going into this particular sector by space agencies and companies. Now, when we're talking about emerging states, there is a spectrum of nations that are involved in space. And these are largely categorized in 5 broad categories. First, you may have non-space nations. These ones basically have no direct involvement whatsoever in space activities, and they lack a clear space policy or institution or even any veracity for a space program. Some of them may show interest in gaining space capabilities, but they're not really developed that much. This forms the bulk of most African states. Currently, about only 20 African states really do have a demonstrable ambition in space. And then you have aspiring space nations. This is the bulk of the African states which are, in space. In these, we have states that have policies and ambitions related to space, but they may have limited infrastructure to fulfill those, those needs. So they usually partner with established powers to gain knowledge and access. And usually they'll have a diplomatic strategy of, positioning themselves as space-friendly nations. This is the same category in which my own country, Uganda, is in currently. Then you have emerging space nations. These ones, such as Brazil, Argentina, South Africa, Egypt, they have a growing space program that is, focused on developing launch technologies, satellites, and industry knowledge. Now, their goal is mostly to become space powers and leaders in their own right, but most of them still lack deep space or human space flight capabilities currently. And then above those, we'll have space-capable nations. Now, these, such as Japan and India, they have advanced launch systems, satellites, and in fact, they actually do launch, some do launch, and they have dedicated space agencies that will allow participation in the global space sector. However, they still seek greater access and influence as their capabilities grow. For example, India's lunar program is an example of this, with orbiters and the lunar rover that are demonstrating expanding space abilities. Then on top of all of this, we'll have spacefaring nations, such as the United States, Russia, China, and a big part of Europe, who possess a full range of space capabilities, including advanced launch vehicles, satellites, space stations, lunar programs, human space flight. They have accumulated significant infrastructure and decades of experience, to obtain leadership in space. Their main need would be to maintain technical prowess and guarantee access to resources, by their own entities that are registered in their own countries. Now, the issues that arise in situ resource utilization when you're looking at the rights and the privilege of spacefaring nations vis-a-vis those of emerging and aspiring space nations would be aligning the interests when it comes to the solidification of leadership by the major space powers through guaranteed access, and also the need or the want of a fair chance to use space resources as capabilities grow of the emerging nations. So without regulation, of course, you'd have resource nationalism, which occurs where established first movers will claim exclusive rights. There are two main theories of resource utilization in space. One of these is called the common heritage of humankind principle, which basically proposes, that managing resources through in space should be through an international regime, and that all these resources should be equitably shared with all. And then the second one is the first come, first served, which basically allows the claiming of resources by whoever can access them first. Now, the latter is mostly what is currently happening in the international space sector, especially with the Artemis Accords and other such agreements that seek to reward actors that have managed to build enough capacity to go to the moon and other, terrestrial bodies. Now, each of these models, of course, has its different implications for equitable growth. However, potential solutions will involve, I would insist, profit sharing, technology transfer, and conservation. However, it's very hard to come up with consensus, especially when there are so many competing viewpoints. There have already been moves to undermine some of the principles that are outlined in the Outer Space Treaty that my colleague just mentioned about, the use of the moon for peaceful uses, because the Outer Space Treaty, just like all the other space treaties, do not clarify on personal property rights in space. So then what would be the step forward? What would be, what should be done? I would suggest a couple of steps that can be taken. One, there needs to be a move to prevent escalating discord and establish cooperation and transparency, which should be prioritized over competition in space. Then also, of course, because while we still have challenging agreements, which are needed to encourage responsibility and communication, the Artemis Accords, for example, would outline principles for mining rights and safety zones. Now, these accords are not signed by all major players yet, but they do have the propensity to promote sustainability if they are properly tweaked. I believe that the accords should be tweaked for future use, especially because they now present one of the best ways through which humanity can access space, deep space, and use the resources that deep space provides for humanity. They also need to be investing in capacity building to enable emerging and aspiring states to develop technical capabilities. And on top of that, we would need to encourage commercial partnerships across entities, different stages of space involvement. Currently, we do not have so many, but there needs to be partnerships between commercial entities and state entities at different times of space involvement. We also need an inclusive government model, such as a coordinating body with representation for both leading and aspiring space nations that can help balance diverse needs. And this is very key because the current spectrum that exists, the current model that exists is not very sustainable. The UN corpus and it's not a very sustainable model. And I believe that that needs to be one that is a bit more inclusive and would allow coordination, especially because the UN Corpus has a very long, what I would call fertility and incubation period for decisions to be made when it comes to space governance. But then also we need to develop conservation practices so that resources that have been attained are not overexploited. This will allow emerging states to find something for themselves when they finally get to build capacity and get to the moon, and other terrestrial bodies, I mean celestial bodies. I would also say that there needs to be a growth of the space industry itself through lower launch costs and greater access, which of course would benefit all parties and would avoid zero-sum mindsets. Now, concluding this talk, I would say that utilizing lunar resources will presents an immense opportunity, but only if done in an equitable and sustainable manner. Solutions to this must balance the interests of established and emerging actors by facilitating cooperation, transparency, and I would say capacity building. With good governance and inclusive technology development, the expansion of space capabilities can uplift all nations and not just a privileged few. And the resources of the moon do not have to be allocated in a zero-sum way. If frameworks are put in place right now that would encourage partnership and prevent harmful consolidation. So in the long run, strengthening the entire space industry will create a rising tide that would allow a new era of space exploration. And together, humanity can cultivate the bounty that I would say resources in space provide for the common good of all. Thank you very much for listening to me, and we'll encourage questions at the end of everyone. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, David, for a masterful presentation and developing a framework that we find very useful, and we will use it. Our next speaker is Olusoji Nestor John, who has cooked very interesting topics for our audience. So Olusoji, the floor is yours.
I'm sorry, Nestor. I don't think we can hear you. Nestor? Yes. You're not muted, but we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm John Olusoji Nestor. I work with the African Regional Center for Space Science and Technology Education in English, Nigeria. My topic for discussion is simple. I have to call it out. Capability in space science and technology, Africa participation in benefit sharing and lunar resources. So I divided my work into 5 parts. The first part talks about space education in Africa. The second part talks about the Moon Agreement on sharing of lunar resources. And the third part talks about the Artemis Accord on lunar resources. The fourth part talks about is on questions on the Artemis Accords, on the Artemis project and Africa. Then the fifth part, I named it concluding answers. So I will be, without wasting time, because I have 15 minutes, I will go on and present and do the presentation. Introducing this topic, I talked about the technological and economic gap between Africa and other developed countries of the world. This gap is wide. This gap presents itself even more in exploration and use of outer space. This same gap keeps widening up on a daily basis on the continent, as the continent keeps losing her highly educated and skilled manpower, that is the engineers and the scientists, to the developed countries of the world. Today we have high level of brain drain in Africa. This is because the continent has failed to provide the right environment to utilize their skills. So they prefer going outside. However, Africa's mining industry is one of the biggest and most important in the world today. This is because Africa has huge, valuable, and extractable natural resources. Africa has a very key role to play in the extraction of minerals from outer space, even in the face of a technologically deficit state. Her experience in mining is needed in the mining of lunar resources. Now, I'll just move on to space education in Africa. And the title I give it is UN Purpose and Space Science and Technology Education in Africa. Decades ago, UN Purpose recognized the problem of low-level knowledge and expertise in the area of space science and technology. There was now need for development of indigenous capability in space science and technology. On that, 3 regional and 1 international meeting organized between 1985 and 1989 by UN, one in India, 1985, that is the first one. The second one was in Mexico. The third one, the second was done in 1986. The third one was done in 1987 in Nigeria, and the international one was done in the UK. Now, participants in those meetings concluded that in order for the developing countries to effectively contribute to the solution of global, regional, and national environmental and resource management problems, there is an urgent need for a higher level of knowledge and expertise in the relevant disciplines by educators, as well as by research and application scientists in these countries. These capabilities, they say, could only be acquired through long-time intensive training. And Purpose therefore recommended to the UN that the United Nations should lead with the active support of its specialized agencies and other international organizations, an international effort to establish regional centers for space science and technology education in existing national regional educational institutions in the developing countries. The recommendation was endorsed by the United Nations General Assembly in 1990. And 4 regional centers were established. 2 in Africa, that is Morocco and Nigeria. 2 in Asia and Pacific, that is in India. 1 in India, that is the Asia and Pacific, and Latin America and the Caribbean, Brazil and Mexico, making 4. Though 2 other regional centers were later inaugurated in 2012 and 2014, respectively, which is that of Jordan, Regional Center for Space Science and Technology Education for Western Asia, and the other one in China, that is Regional Center for Space Science and Technology Education in Asia and the Pacific, which is in Benji. And the Africa Regional Center for Space Science and Technology Education, in English, where I work, is to develop indigenous capability in research and application in the core areas of space science and technology for sustainable development of the Anglophone Africa countries, that is the English-speaking countries of Africa. Why the African Regional Center for Space Science and Technology Education in French is to develop indigenous capability in research and applications in the core areas of space science and technology for sustainable development for the Francophone African countries, that is the French-speaking countries of Africa. Now, the curricula for which the regional centers program are based are developed through UNOSA by the United Nations. Key areas where the training is focused that we still have today are remote sensing and geographic information system, that is GIS, satellite meteorology and global climate, satellite communication, and basic space and atmospheric science. Later, two other areas were added, which is the GNSS and space law. Now, without going any further, I would like to go to the main area, the core area of this webinar. That is the Moon Agreement on, that is the sharing of lunar resources. So let me talk on the Moon Agreement on the sharing of lunar. So I am just going to draw some of the provisions of the Moon Agreement that dwell on lunar sharing of lunar resources. The provision of the Moon Agreement apply to other celestial bodies within the solar system. So it is not just the moon. It applies to other bodies, other celestial bodies within the solar system. The exploration and the use of the moon shall be, according to Article 4 of the Moon Agreement, the province of all mankind. So it is for everybody. And shall be carried out for the benefit and in the interest of all countries, whether developed, technologically developed, whether scientifically developed, whether economically developed or not. It is for the interest and benefit of all countries. State parties shall be guided by the principle of cooperation and mutual assistance. I have a reason for bringing out these provisions. State parties shall have the right to collect on and remove from the moon samples of the mineral and other substances. But for what? Only for scientific investigation. The moon and its natural resources are the common heritage of mankind. We all own the moon and the natural resources. The moon is not subject to national appropriation by any claim of sovereignty by means of use or occupation or by any other means. This is based from the Outer Space Treaty. So no natural resources in space shall become the property of any state, international, intergovernmental, or non-governmental organizations, national organizations, or non-governmental entity, or any of the natural persons. Now, the interesting part of the Moon Agreement is Article 11.5, which states that state parties to this agreement hereby undertake to establish an international regime, including appropriate procedures to govern the exploitation of the natural resources of the moon, as such exploitation is about to become feasible. Article 11.5. Now, Article 9.2 of the Moon Agreement, which is relevant here, is stations shall be installed in such a manner that they do not impede the free access to all areas of the moon, of personnel, vehicles, and equipment of other state parties conducting activities on the moon in accordance with the provision of the Moon Agreement or of Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty. Now, the question is this. If going by this, okay, let me not question this for now. We will get back to this. Now, Article 11.7 of the Moon Agreement says the main purpose of the international regime to be established shall include A, the orderly and safe development of natural resources of the moon, B, the rational management of those resources, C, the expansion of opportunities in the use of those resources, D, an equitable, which I find most interesting, an equitable sharing by all state parties in the benefits derived from those resources, whereby the interests and needs of the developing countries, as well as those of other countries which have contributed either directly or indirectly to the exploration of the moon, shall be given special consideration. This, I think, is the most valuable article, Article 11.7D. Now, what is the role of Africa in Article 7.1 of the Moon Agreement? Now, the Article 7.1 says, in exploring and using the moon, state parties shall take measures to prevent the disruption of the existing balance of its environment, whether by introducing adverse changes in the environment, by its harmful contamination through the introduction of extra environmental matter or otherwise. State parties shall also take measures to avoid harmful affecting the environment of the earth through the introduction of extraterrestrial matters or otherwise. Now, the question is, does Africa as a continent has a key role to play here? I mean, in preventing the disruption of the existing balance of its environment, of space environment? The answer, we'll know it later, which is in the affirmative. Now, the Artemis Accords on lunar resources. I just gave those provisions of the Moon Agreement. Now, I'm coming to the Artemis Accord. At the end of the day, we'll know why these provisions are necessary. Now, Section 1 of the Artemis Accord says the purpose of the Artemis Accord, which is to establish a common vision via a practical set of principles, guidelines, and best practice to enhance the governance of the civil exploration and use of outer space with the intention of advancing the Artemis program. Section 2.1 of the Artemis Accord provides that cooperative activities regarding the exploration and use of outer space may be implemented through appropriate instruments, such as memoranda of understanding, implementing arrangement under existing government-to-government agreement, agency-to-agency arrangement, and other instruments. Now, I have a question that I need to ask here. And the question is, I have some questions. And the questions are, will the advanced countries be willing to bilaterally have cooperative activities with countries in Africa? Going by the developmental deficit of the Africa countries, will the advanced countries be willing to have bilateral cooperative activities with countries in Africa? 2, how many existing government-to-government agreements, agency-to-agency arrangements between the developed countries and those of Africa we have at present. Japan and US and other countries and US have all these arrangements on ground. Nigeria has signed the Artemis Accord, and up till now, I have not heard any of this arrangement between Nigeria and any of these super worlds, the super countries. Would this have been different if the arrangements made in the Moon Agreement was to be followed? See Article 11.7 of the Moon Agreement, which I earlier referred to. Now, I am Section 10.2 of the Accords, says again that the signatories emphasize that the extraction and utilization of space resources, including any recovery from the surface or subsurface of the Moon, Mars, comets, and astronauts, should be executed in a manner that complies with the Outer Space Treaty and in support of safe and sustainable space activities. The signatories affirm that the extraction of space resources does not inherently constitute national appropriation under Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty, and the contract and other legal instruments relating to space resources should be consistent with the treaty. I have earlier spoken about appropriation, national appropriation. And when I made reference to Article 9.2 of the Moon Agreement, I have a reason for that reference. Now, we all know what mining is. We are all familiar with mining. You cannot mine in a place. Sometimes mining may take months or years in a particular place. And I still have not been able to see one person that will convince me that during the period of mining, there won't be national appropriation of the areas being mined. Take, for instance, if the United States of America has its mining equipment
I believe we lost John. Maybe he's having trouble with his connection. But Chris, would you like to wait a couple of minutes for him, or?
I think we will.
Hello.
So, okay, it's back.
It's like you lost me?
Yeah, like 1 minute, but it's okay. If you go like 1 minute back in your speech, it's okay.
Okay, 1 minute back in my speech.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. I'll do. Let me see. Is it the area where I talked about Artemis Accord on lunar resources?
Yeah, you were.
Yeah, you were talking about mining activities and the time that they take and how this wouldn't be
okay.
appropriation.
Article 2 that the Artemis Accords usually refer to. Okay, I was saying that all of us are aware of the time mining activities take. That if a country, for instance, like the US, is mining a particular place, it could take about more than months or even years to mine in a particular place. And I see that for the period for which that country is having mining activities in that area, that country is appropriating that area for that period, because no country will go there. No country can go there, near there. And that takes us to, because that is section 10(2) of the Accords. And that takes us back to section 9, article 9(2) of the Moon Agreement, that says for the period that a country is investigating an area, that the facilities should be placed in a way that other countries can access those areas. Now, I move on to questions on the Artemis project and Africa. And I ask 4 questions. Who is the Artemis project for? Is it for the poor, technologically disadvantaged African countries? Or is it for the rich, technologically developed states? Question 2, do we need a better regime of governance that will be more inclusive of nations, including African countries? Question 3, does Africa have a role to play in the project? That is the Artemis project. And question 4, is the Artemis project a bad idea? Now, I am going to conclude with my concluding answers. So question 1, at present, the Artemis project is for the big technologically advanced states. While while a speaker was talking, Kingsley, he made mention of Africans not signing multilateral treaties. Yes. If you don't have the power to struggle somewhere, you don't need to sign those laws that affect the people who struggle there. You don't. Nigeria has signed the Artemis Accord. I have not seen any way we are getting ready to participate in the project. And I bet you no country may be willing, even if we are going to have, maybe when African countries are there and they are ready to cooperate with each other and buy the technology to get there. But none of these countries will be willing, because cooperation has, for 2 countries to cooperate, each of them has something to put on the table. And that is why you see the cooperation between Japan and US on the Artemis project. They have not called Nigeria, and they may not call Nigeria, except to have very good something. Is it our technology? Is it the money? We don't even have the money back here. So, concluding as hello. Hello?
Hi, we can hear you.
Yeah, we hear you. Okay, frozen again. maybe we wait a minute. And then we will move to Madi, but we just went what Olusoji, so you can
While we wait, while we wait, please, if you allow me, I'd like to say that since this is a webinar that is directly related to the benefit sharing project that we co-chair in the Moon Village Association, it's great to have all these inputs because they are directly related to what we're trying to propose there.
Can you hear me now?
Hi, John. Yeah, you're back. Thank you.
I want to conclude. I will conclude. It's part of what we face here in Africa. So I'm sorry this is happening. So I was saying that answer to question 1 that I asked earlier is at present, the Artemis project is for the big technologically advanced states. We don't have the technology to get to the moon now. We don't have the money. Our people are suffering. We don't have the money. We don't have the technology. Yeah, we have men who are still behind, few men who are still staying behind, but most of our experts have gone out to develop what? To look for greener pastures. Now, the second question is, yes, we need a better regime of governance that will be more inclusive of nations, including African countries, and some provisions of the Moon Agreement, especially those relating to the sharing of the Moon resources, should be infused. So question 3 is yes, Africa has a key role to play. Technologically, Africa is not in a position to compete in the Artemis project, which I have mentioned earlier. However, Africa, with a rich knowledge base for best practices in mining activities, her participation is necessary to learn from. This knowledge is essential in new fields like space mining to avoid mistakes. Then the last question, Artemis project is not a bad idea. All that is needed is a better inclusive governance regime. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Olusoji. And in other words, we would need an Artemis organization that works for the entire world, not just the advanced countries, but the so-called emerging space countries, regardless of their economic or technological status.
Exactly.
Maybe we still have to invent it. Maybe we can do that. And like Suyan was saying, Suyan and I are co-chairs of the MVA benefit sharing project. So we organize. So some of us here have been friends and working together for a long time, and we organize this webinar also to develop materials and frameworks to support our work for the benefit sharing project. And I must say, the 3 presentations so far really fulfill that goal. So thank you so much to all the panelists. And that provides us with a transition to herself as hard in the past years and benefit sharing on space and lunar activities. And she will now debrief and recommendations. So that is going to be very interesting. And thanks to the audience for participating here. And now, thank you. The floor is yours, Maddie.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much. I'll try to go quickly. I know we're running a little short on time, but I want to share about our research from the SGAC side, that our topic is covering research sharing a little bit more broadly in the space sector. And I have a couple of case studies to look at from our research. We're by no means prescriptive, mostly just looking at some of the challenges and points that were raised by all three of the other panelists, and how the different models are addressing these. So when we say resource sharing, these are a lot of the same issues, especially that Kingsley talked about earlier. The challenges that face the space sector in Africa include lack of human capital, especially the brain drain factor, financial barriers, competition, as well as some geopolitical factors as well, political tensions both in countries and out of countries. But we see resource sharing as an opportunity to tackle some of these challenges and mitigate some of the challenges to varying degrees. So one of the models we're looking at is bilateral partnerships. The most traditional, especially within the space sector, we have the Broglio Space Center in Kenya, which was a partnership between Kenya and the Italian Space Agency back in 1967, the very early stages of the space race. Unfortunately, there was a lot of lack of buy-in for this program from Kenya, and a lot of lack of cooperation on the factor. So as the Italian Space Agency kind of decreased activity there, it's largely fallen by the wayside. And we still see these bilateral partnerships popping up. For example, there is now a planned partnership between Djibouti and China in OBOC that in the next 5 years they expect to get settled. But by and large, the structure of it looks a lot like the structure for the Broglio Space Center. And in addition to kind of having this lack of buy-in challenge, there are also some legal questions around the OBOC spaceport, in that Djibouti is not a signatory of the Outer Space Treaty nor the Artemis Accords, whereas China is an Outer Space Treaty signatory. And so the idea that using these bilateral partnerships as a way to kind of skirt the legal multilateral partnerships is a growing concern as these things stack on top of each other. Whereas when we look at some of the multilateral partnerships, a very good example of this is one of the many projects that the BRICS partnership is tackling is on quantum communication. Quantum communication being a huge focus for space and space communication going forward. There have been some additional challenges where the idea of the BRICS partnership having countries of similar economic terms and similar geopolitical status kind of sharing their weight. Unfortunately, there is a pretty big delta in terms of where these countries stand with their quantum communication research. That South Africa and Brazil are pretty far behind their other three competitors. In addition, the program faces a lot of stress from outside political tensions, one of which being the kind of cold border tensions between China and India, that China and India don't share research between themselves, as well as Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. Now that sanctions on Russia, especially from the US, are impacting Russian research, it is also having an impact on their other partnerships, including South Africa. So we see this cooperation starting to peak in other sectors. It hasn't fully materialized yet, but a lot of the multilateral partnerships, even with some of the big countries, are still sensitive to a lot of these same strains. And of course, it's hard to talk about all this without talking about the private sector and the role of direct investment from either multinational corporations or public-private partnerships. So two initiatives that were announced with the US Africa Business Forum last December were an investment by Atlas Space Operations with Rwanda in creating a large satellite for communications, and a investment with Planet Labs on imaging, especially about drought risk and environmental monitoring. Both of these programs are still kind of in the launch phase. It's a little bit too early to tell, but we do see stress manifesting in relation to Starlink. Starlink has recently launched in Kenya, Malawi, and Mozambique. It's been a huge opportunity for leapfrogging and kind of catching up to broadband disconnects. But it has also run into a tension where private sector against regulatory concerns. For example, South Africa is one of the few countries that is not eligible for Starlink, as South Africa's telecoms policy requires that companies have at least 30% ownership of historically disadvantaged communities, and Starlink and a lot of these other companies don't meet those requirements. And then, of course, in the area of international organizations, there's a huge opportunity outside of the treaties that we've been talking about, the Moon Treaty, Artemis Accords, Outer Space Treaty, and of course, all the UN activity. I also wanted to highlight some kind of other international organization activities as kind of alternatives. So the International Standards Organization, or International Organization for Standardization, establishes voluntary consensus standards, and these are used without business. They help create both synergy within the business community and in the commerce sector, as well as interoperability of technology. Standards development itself can be a huge opportunity for countries to have their foot in the door, have a voice in some of these conversations with a lot less buy-in than it would take for something like the UN. In addition, the ISO has a twinning initiative. So the twinning initiative pairs a established member of a committee, regardless of the topic that it might be, with a newer developing representative. So even if a standardization body in a country is still developing, still young, doesn't have a whole lot of brain access, they can partner and learn from an older, more experienced member. And so this helps mitigate some of the time constraints that it's, in order to participate in standardization, you have to have the personnel and the time and the capital to travel, but also but by twinning, you can mitigate some of those constraining factors and in turn help develop an internal sector with very little cost on the partnering body. So with that, I think I got through everything pretty quickly, and we should have some time for questions.
All right. Thank you very much, Maddie, for this also very practical and presentation of frameworks that will be also very useful in the context of the benefit sharing project. We had not a speaker, but someone who wrote an interesting paper in relation with this topic. And I put in a chat the link to the abstract. The topic is about understanding the benefit of all provision in international space instrument, making a case for an empirical approach for developing countries. So it's basically how countries interpret the Outer Space Treaty and other space law instruments in terms of access and benefit sharing, and how that impact their policies. So Promise Okezie, who is based in Lagos, Nigeria, is through going almost done writing a paper, and when the paper is ready, we will provide it as one of the references of the benefit sharing project for not only Africa, but globally, because it's a global problem with local solutions. So now I'm happy to handle the floor to Suyan, who is now the host, and will wrap up this session, but not before having considered some questions. So if you have questions, now is the time to ask. And if you don't have any questions, we have a lot of questions. So anyway, we can still talk. Suyan, the floor is yours. And thanks
Thank
again.
you. Thank you, Chris. Thank you to all our panelists. As we mentioned, your contributions are really important for the benefit sharing project, which we are developing as part of the work of the Adaptive Governance Working Group in the Moon Village. And also to share with everyone, these presentations are being recorded. They will be available on YouTube. So we'll be happy to share the link with everyone, with the GAGSLA members, the Benefit Sharing Project members, and in many other institutions, because those are very interesting thoughts, and they are from many perspectives, they are thinking outside of the box. So it's very important material that we shall have into consideration whenever we're discussing the development of a legal framework or governance structures for advancing with space resource activities and with lunar exploration in general. So thank you very much, everyone. I was, it was very important for me because from your presentations, I got to know sometimes, and sometimes I got to be sure that I'm a Brazilian representative. I live in Brazil, and many of our worries, many of our struggles and challenges are very similar. They're pretty much the same from many perspectives. And it was very good to hear also your questions and your thoughts that you shared about the way forward. So I believe that cooperation is key to advance, as many of you have presented here today, and regional cooperation and cooperation on the Global South is also one of the most important things that we have to bear in mind, and we have to build awareness on that from my point of view. So I would like to thank you all and invite everyone, all the attendees, to share your questions with our panelists. And I will also hand it to Eunice, who I believe Eunice will co-host this questions and answers section with me, and maybe she already has some thoughts to share or some questions to present to our invitees today. Eunice, would you like to take the floor?
Thank you very much, Susan. From where you have just mentioned, I would like to thank the speakers as well for taking us through a very comprehensive program on benefits sharing and the legal framework, which so far Africa has. That was David, and also the second speaker who has taken us through John, who has taken us through the gaps which are in existence in the moment, and even from the last speaker. And what has been a key highlight was the fact that we need more collaboration than competition. And maybe one question, I have not seen any question from the messages box, but one question which has also come into my mind was then, since there is a common factor of, there's a consensus from the speakers that we need collaboration than competition, then what strategies would they suggest right now, even considering they have also shared their proposals, but what strategies would they give for the African countries in terms of employing, or what strategies would the African countries need to employ in developing a framework for benefits sharing? That would be the first question. Do we need to go through another treaty, or as David, I don't know whether it was David who suggested getting another model of governance another model of governance instead of the Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Spaces. In terms of the shorter term framework, what strategies should we employ in order to ensure that Africa also benefits from the outer space activities? Then secondly, the second question was with regards to companies, considering that nowadays a lot of the outer space activities are being conducted by corporations and multinational corporations, as David was saying. He pointed out rightly that we have at least, for example, in Africa, 23 or so. So how can we then regulate that? Because the Moon Treaty, for example, the OST envisages a situation where it's the states who are undertaking these activities and not the multinational corporations. Then how can we enter into negotiations with corporations, and yet the international law does not recognize the corporations as a person, because they envisage only the international law was created, and even the treaties themselves envisages a situation where the participants are the state. How can we incorporate corporations in this process of benefit sharing for the benefit of the African continent as well? Maybe they can just highlight on that. Besides that, I've learned a lot as well. Thank you very much. This was very informative. And thank you for sharing and ensuring that at least the webinar will be recorded so that at least you can go back and review the presentations. Yes. Otherwise, thank you very much.
Yeah, do we need to react to that?
Yes, please, John, you're welcome to.
Okay, for me, for the first question, we need a different model. Like I said there, I think we need a model that will have some of the things in the accords and some important provisions from the Moon Treaty, especially the sharing model. So we need another model of, so if African countries cannot go to the moon or to any of the areas who have the resources, they can as well give out what belongs to them for money, or they can at least gain from it. So the sharing model of the Moon Agreement is necessary. It's necessary for a new regime. The Artemis, the Accords provisions, some of the provisions are beautiful, they can still be there. But the sharing model of the Moon Agreement must not be thrown away. That is that. For the private entities or organizations that I think the international law is beginning to recognize individuals. And again, the treaty provisions recognize individuals, but through their states. It is not that it does not recognize organizations to carry out space activities, but those organizations must carry out space activities through their states. So in this case, we see states as parties, not individuals or the private entities or organizations as parties. So if SpaceX, for instance, is in the moon to mine minerals, if you look at the Competitive Launch Act of America, for instance, it says that states, that individuals who have the power to extract minerals can take that minerals, can do whatever they want to do with that minerals, can own it. So the national space legislations of those countries, like America, Luxembourg, and US, already have it. So it means there are entities from those states can actually go to the moon under the cover of their states to mine those minerals, and own those minerals. I don't know if that has answered Eunice's question.
Maybe to add a small little bit, the concept of collaboration and finding a different regime or model for resource utilization and benefit sharing is one that has been plagued the international space for a while. But I find a bit more insight in the paper that was developed by the Hague International Space Resources Governance Working Group in 2019, called Building Blocks for the Development of an International Framework on Space Resources Activities. A group of experts from Leiden University and other space universities discussed what a future model would look like, especially given the fact that the Outer Space Treaty is now pretty old. It has not been amended at all, and the circumstances in which the OST came into place have since sort of changed, because the Outer Space Treaty came into place at the height of the Cold War between the US and the former Soviet Union, and at that time it was not pretty much envisaged that there would be all sorts of actors coming into space, into the space arena. And currently we are having a whole host of space actors coming in, and not just for the formally envisaged military uses of space, but rather space is now becoming commercial. It's retaining a bit of the military-ish, but becoming more commercial in purpose. And for that reason, the circumstances have since changed. And because they have changed, there needs to be work between different actors. I would suggest that more agreements between commercial space actors and state-sponsored space actors be devised. For example, we continuously find that many national or state space actors are struggling, to say the least, not only fiscally, but also technologically. I'll give an example. NASA, for example, struggled to develop a proper launch system, for deep space. The SLS became very expensive, a very expensive venture that was nevertheless providing little vitality compared to, for example, the Starship by SpaceX, and yet resource utilization and even benefit sharing are going to heavily rely on space exploration becoming cheaper and cheaper. If space exploration continues being as expensive as it is currently, there would be what you may call a zero-sum kind of advantage for those who can access because they've invested so much. When they access, they want to keep. Everyone wants to keep. I've invested so much money. I cannot be, sharing with those who haven't put in as much as I have. And yet, when space exploration becomes cheaper, it allows aspiring and emerging states to invest a bit also and gain some kind of vitality out of that exercise. So therefore, it makes it very imperative that the entities, that emerging states and emerging entities get into collaborations with private actors, private commercial actors that have the capability to make space exploration cheaper. That way, they do not have to overly stretch their already thin resources in order to achieve something that could very much well have been achieved in a much more cheaper manner. So international law currently needs to reach a point of recognizing agreements that are entered between non-space actors and space actors. Because as it is currently, the Liability Convention, for example, does not recognize non-space actors as liable, actors within the space arena. And yet they currently they're probably becoming the biggest actors, if anything, So when there is a gatekeeping of the space arena from, the private actors, we are continuously going to have a bit of an issue. So I would suggest that a new regime is negotiated, possibly if anything outside the mainline UN Corpus kind of thing, because UN Corpus has its own issues, with the time frames and everything, and a lot of politics. But if there can be something negotiated outside on the sidelines of, let's say, the Artemis Accords, that would allow for a merger between space and non-space actors in an internationally recognized framework, I believe that would greatly assist aspiring and emerging states and greatly foster resource utilization and benefit sharing.
Thank you, John. Thank you, David. Kingsley, would you like to add something to this or any other topic that you may think we would like to hear?
Okay. Thank you, Suyan. I think I agree with David and Olushola on the comments they've made so far with respect to unbundling the current governance regime for outer space, because as it is now, it is more political than scientific and legal. And since space is becoming more or less commercialized by the day, then it has to be run by commercial people as well, not by politicians, as we have in UN Octopus. So I totally align myself with the submissions of David and John as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Yes, indeed. I have to highlight here what our panelists brought about cooperation and coordination for activities, collaboration, and also the disparity among the global north spacefaring nations and the global south countries who are emerging space nations or developing or even nations without space activities for now. So it's something that we have to bear in mind all the time, and it's something that definitely guides our work in the benefit sharing project and what we intend to develop for the interest of the whole society and humanity on the benefits of space activities. So thank you very much, to all of our panelists for your great contributions to the research and the work that we are developing, and for the contributions to all society who is here attending this webinar, and also who will watch you later on YouTube. And I give the floor back to Chris. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Suyan and everyone, all the panelists. I was raising my hand not necessarily to grab the floor back, but to make one point, to rebound on what David just said. At the MVA, we have many working groups, including very interesting things like analogs, lunar analogs. But we have one working group, lunar analogs working globally. We have one working group in particular, which is the Lunar Commerce and Economics Working Group. And basically what it does is to develop the lunar commerce portfolio to look at these lunar and lunar markets. So like David said, transportation getting cheaper, that is the game changer. SpaceX and many other. And then of course you have mining, but you also need energy and food and all these other markets to serve infrastructures on the moon. So what we do is to try to understand the value chains, who supplies what and who buys what, because eventually that kind of study should be useful to emerging space countries to look at where they could fit in the value chain. Not everybody needs rockets, but you can do something very important, like a piece of a rover or solar panel or a biological device, maybe something to purify water, whatever. There are thousands of industrial and practical applications that could involve emerging space countries in lunar value chains, in lunar business, and really get into the action. There is action for many more things than just rockets. So eventually we want to circulate this work around the world. Energies, access, and part of access, like we discussed today, is being included the glass between the North and the global South. And eventually, to use a metaphor, to have some kinds of art for every country on Earth, and not just the economically and technologically advanced North. That's more or less the idea, and I think eventually we will get there. But we still have to create. Back to you, Suyan, if you want to wrap up.
Thank you, Chris. Yes, I would just like to thank everyone. Eunice had to leave us, so I will not give the floor to her for her final considerations, but I would like to thank you all. It was a very productive webinar, and your the inputs that you gave us and the food for thought and the thoughts that you shared with us will be essential for the way forward of the benefit sharing project and many other debates that we are having abroad in many international fora. It's excellent that you had the time to share your experiences and your knowledge and your thoughts with us. so we can take those ideas to more people, and then we can discuss having all your propositions and your concerns in mind. So thank you very much to all of you for being here with us today. And I would like to hand the floor, to give the floor back to Chris to his final words. Thank you.
All right, so this sounds more like a tennis game at Roland Garros, but it's too hot everywhere. The earth is burning. We are talking about the moon today, but we also need space-based solar power and space for climate action. That's a different topic. Again, we would like to thank you, everyone, the attendants, our panelists, the organizer. And remember, power and the ability to do things is never given, is never served on a silver plate. We all have to fight for it. And if we work to increase the cooperation between the global south and the emerging space countries, and with the countries that are so far more advanced in space, and in particular the moon, and if we can make that a story that is more interesting than just the US, China competing and somewhere behind you at Europe. No, we can do better than that. And today is the beginning of that change. And we look forward to working with all of you to make it happen. And again, thank you very much. And change is up to us to make it happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I enjoyed the whole process. Thank you. And we still have more time to work together. And thank you, Suyan. Thank you very much. Kisney, thank you. David, thank you. So we'll have more time to work together on any projects concerning this area. We can work together and get something out.
All right.
Thank you so much, guys, for this time. It's been really, really, really amazing, and also for the platform to discuss these ideas and to, broadcast our thoughts. Grace and Suyan, Jessica, thank you so much, and to my fellow panelists, John and Kingsley. I'm honored and looking forward to even more and bigger conversations around this area.
Hello, thank you, everyone. It's been an awesome opportunity sharing my thoughts and also learning a lot about space and moon environment. And please, Moon Village, you have one new member today, so I'm going to join up and follow your activities as well. So thank you, everyone. It's been awesome. Thank you, my co-panelists. John, thank you. And John, look forward to seeing you and also collaborating with you and David in further research. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. And I would just like to remind everyone to take a look at the paper that Promise OKZ has produced for this webinar, and that will be part of the references of the benefit sharing project as well, which is understanding the benefit of all provision in international space instruments, making a case for an empirical approach for developing countries. So the link to his paper is here in the chat, and we'll post it on YouTube as well. It's an abstract, but it's a research which is very advanced, and the paper will come soon, and then we'll share it with you through our social media and the webpage of the MVA and the Benefit Sharing Project. So you're all welcome to take a look at his research. And share your thoughts with us. Thank you. Chris, back to you.
Okay, it's like a rocket countdown to SpaceX exploding. So anyway, it's a countdown to a launch to our next adventures. And again, thank you very much, all of you, and we look forward to continue working together. And you also are all invited to join the Moon Village Association as members. If you have not yet done it, and somehow we will find a way, even if you're not a member, but we have a working relationship. So in future, we will certainly find a way to involve people like you who have contributed a lot. So we'll keep in touch, and we'll keep in touch through the benefit sharing project as well. So thank you very much again. And I believe it is time to conclude. Thank you, and see you later.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you, Jessica. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.